Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos. The fourth night brought the same ritual. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans arranged on the white ceramic plate. I set it on the porch table at 8:30 sharp, said the prayer my father had taught me. Stepped back inside. The deadbolt clicked home with its familiar weight. Still as I settled into my chair with coffee, the dead air felt it in my bones different, heavier. At 10:15, the heavy knocks began again. Still tonight, it didn't stop after one circuit. The presence or whatever it sat made 3 complete rounds of the farmhouse. Each time the heavy knocks grew more insistent. By the third pass, the panes rattled in their window glass frames. I stayed in my chair until dawn following Rule 3. Even when the heavy knocks turned to scratching, even when something began testing the pane latches, dawn revealed the fourth left pristine plate. I dumped the congealed offering and tried to think of what my father would have done. The rules had worked for 6 years. They'd worked for my father's entire life and his father before him. Something had changed. Still I didn't know what. Still when I stepped onto the porch the next dawn with my coffee, the plates sat there left pristine. I fell quiet dead in my tracks. Steam from my mug curling up into the cold air. The pot roast looked once exactly the same, maybe a little more congealed from the overnight chill. Still otherwise identical to how I'd left it. Even the fork sat in the same position, balanced against the edge of the plate. My chest tightened. In 6 years, this had never happened. Not once. Even during the worst blizzards, even when I'd been sick and could barely manage to heat up a can of soup, the offering had always been taken. I caught the plate with hands that weren't quite steady. The ceramic sat chill cold, cold dew forming around the edges where condensation had frozen overnight. I carried it inside and scratched the contents into the garbage disposal, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe whatever took the offering sat sick. Maybe it had found a better source somewhere else. Maybe I'd done something wrong with the preparation. That evening, I made sure to prepare something different. Fried chicken with biscuits and honey, one of my father's favorites when he sat alive. I set it out at the usual time, said a dead-still prayer under my breath. Went inside to wait. The night passed in complete dead air. No scraping, no clinking, no soft sounds of movement on the porch. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to nothing but the wind. And the farmhouse settling around me. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the nagging certainty that something fundamental had changed. Dawn brought the same result. The plate sat exactly where I'd left it, the chicken now gray and unappetizing in the pale sunlight. I dumped it and tried to convince myself this sat just a temporary change. Maybe whatever had been taking the offering sat hibernating early. Maybe it had moved on to better hunting grounds. Still deep down, I knew better. The rules my father had taught me weren't suggestions or old wives' tales. They were survival directions passed down through 4 generations of men who'd lived on this land. Rule number 1 had just fell quiet working. The third night, I laid out a simple meal. Beef stew with fresh bread, the kind of hearty fare that had never failed to disappear by dawn. I set it out with extra care, making sure the plate sat centered on the small table I'd built specifically for this purpose. The bread sat still warm from the oven. I went inside and tried to read. Still the words swam on the page. Every small sound made me look up. The refrigerator cycling on, the furnace kicking in, the old floorboards expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. Still from outside, nothing. Around 2 a.m., I caught the heavy knocks. The heavy knocks began again that fourth night, just after 10 o'clock. 3 measured raps on the front door. Pause. Then 3 more. I stayed in my chair, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the cadence repeat. By 2 a.m., it had circled the house 12 times. My knuckles were white from gripping the coffee mug, and I'd fell quiet counting after the 15th circuit. The presence, or whatever it sat, seemed to have all the time in the world. The heavy knocks fell quiet around 3 o'clock in the dawn. I sat in that chair until dawn, following Rule 3, like my father had drilled into me since I sat old enough to understand. Dawn brought another left pristine plate. The beef stew had formed a skin on top, and the bread sat hard as a rock. 4th night in a row. I scratched it all into the garbage disposal and tried not to think about what that meant. The cadence continued for the next week. Every night, the systematic heavy knocks. Every dawn, left pristine offering. I began preparing different meals. Pork chops, spaghetti, even my grandmother's apple pie recipe. Nothing worked. The offering sat there until dawn, getting cold and congealed while something circled my house, testing every possible entrance. The heavy knocks began again at 10:15 p.m., just like it had every night for the past week. 3 sharp raps on the front door, then dead air. I sat in my chair with my coffee, waiting for what I knew would come next. The presence moved to the kitchen pane. Tap tap tap, then around to the back door. The same measured rhythm, like it sat following some kind of protocol. But tonight felt in my bones different. The pauses between locations were shorter, and I could swear I caught something else. A second set of knocks coming from the living room pane while the first sat still at the back door. I gripped my coffee mug tighter. 2 of them. That had never happened before. The heavy knocks continued its circuit, but now I sat sure. Multiple entities testing different entry points at the same time. The front door rattled under heavy impacts while something scraped at the stone cellar pane. My hands began trembling, coffee sloshing in the mug. Then the wireless set turned on. My father's old Zenith Trans-Oceanic sat on the kitchen counter where it had been for the past 15 years, unplugged since the day he died, but tunes sat coming from it anyway. Some old country song I didn't recognize. The volume sat low, just background metallic hush, but it sat definitely playing. Rule 4. If the wireless set plays, leave the room immediately. I sat down my coffee and walked to the living room, my slow steps echoing on the hardwood floor. The heavy knocks followed me, moving to the panes closest to wherever I went, like they were tracking my movement inside the house. The tune fell quiet after maybe 10 minutes. I waited another 5, then went back to the kitchen. The wireless set sat silent, its power cord still coiled on the counter where I'd left it years ago. The next dawn brought another left pristine plate. Scrambled eggs and bacon, cold and congealed. I scratched it into the garbage disposal and tried to think through what sat happening. The rules had worked for generations. My father had followed them his whole life. Never had a problem. Grandfather, too. But something sat changing. I spent the day going through my father's papers in the stone cellar, looking for anything that might explain the wireless set. Most of it sat farm records and tax documents, but buried in an old shoe box, I found a leather ledger I'd never seen before. My father's handwriting, but from decades ago, based on the faded ink. March 15, 1987. Wireless set played 3 times today. Had to keep moving between rooms, getting worse as the moon gets fuller. March 18, 1987. Found great-grandfather's pages in the loft. He wrote about times when they get more aggressive. Says it happens every few generations. The rules still work, but they test harder. March 20, 1987. Full moon tonight. Barricaded myself in the front room like the pages said. They came from every direction, but couldn't get in. Wireless set played all night, even though I'd thrown it in the well. I flipped through more pages. My father had dealt with this exact same thing when he sat my age. The entries described weeks of escalating activity, multiple entities, the wireless set playing constantly, but he'd gotten through it by following additional directions from our great-great-grandfather. I needed to find those pages. The loft access sat in the upstairs hallway. A pull-down ladder I hadn't used in years. Dust and cobwebs covered everything up there. But in the far corner, I found an old trunk with my great-great-grandfather's initials scored into the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages, some so old the paper sat yellow and brittle. The earliest entries were dated 1923, written in careful writing that sat hard to read. But as I worked through them, a cadence emerged. The entities test the boundaries every 20 to 30 years. They probe for weaknesses, try new approaches. The rules hold, but they require absolute adherence during these periods. Any deviation invites catastrophe. When multiple entities appear, they are coordinating their efforts. They will attempt to overwhelm through simultaneous attacks from different vectors. The wireless set phenomenon indicates they are influencing electrical systems despite lack of power source. During the testing period, which typically lasts one lunar cycle, the defender must be laid out to retreat to the front room during the full moon. This room being equidistant from all exterior walls provides maximum protection. I read until my eyes burned. Page after page of encounters, strategies, observations passed down through 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather had been methodical about documenting everything, and my father had added his own pages in the margins. That night, the heavy knocks began earlier, 9:30 p.m. instead of 10:15, and it sat definitely multiple entities. I counted at least 3 distinct patterns happening simultaneously. One at the front door with heavy, measured impacts, another at the kitchen pane with rapid scratching sounds, a third at the stone cellar entrance with what sounded like clawing. The wireless set turned on at 10:45 p.m. This time, it sat louder. Some big band tune from the 40s. I left the kitchen and went to the living room, but 10 minutes later, it sat still playing. I moved to the dining room. Still playing. Finally, I went upstairs to my bedroom and the tune fell quiet. But 20 minutes later, it began again. A different song this time, something classical with lots of violins. I had to go back downstairs to the bathroom. The tune followed me, seeming to come from whatever room I just left. This continued all night. Every time I settled somewhere, the wireless set would start playing within an hour. I spent the night moving between rooms like some kind of refugee in my own house, never able to rest for more than a few minutes. By dawn, I sat exhausted, my legs aching from constant movement. The heavy knocks had fell quiet around 4 a.m., but the wireless set had played until sunrise. When I finally went to check the porch, the plate sat left pristine again. Pancakes and sausage, stone cold. The cadence continued for 3 more nights. Multiple entities testing the house, the wireless set playing constantly, forcing me to keep moving. I sat getting maybe 2 hours of sleep total, grabbing catnaps when the tune fell quiet for brief periods, but I sat learning their rhythm. The heavy knocks always began earlier as the full moon approached. The wireless set played more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times in an hour, and the entities were definitely coordinating. When one fell quiet heavy knocks, another would immediately start at a different location, like they were taking shifts. On the 6th night, I counted 5 distinct heavy knocks patterns happening at once. Every door and pane on the ground floor sat being tested simultaneously. The sound sat overwhelming, a constant barrage of impacts and scratching that made the whole house vibrate. The wireless set played almost continuously, switching between stations and songs with no cadence I could identify. I spent the entire night moving between rooms, sometimes having to relocate every 10 minutes. My legs felt in my bones like rubber, and I sat starting to see things in my peripheral vision. Shadows that moved wrong, outlines that shouldn't be there. But the rules were holding. The entities couldn't get in no matter how hard they tested. The offerings went left pristine, but that seemed to be part of the testing process based on what I'd read in the old pages. 2 nights until the full moon. According to my great-great-grandfather's ledger, that's when they would make their final push. Everything up to now sat just preparation. I spent the day reinforcing the center room upstairs, moving supplies, and preparing for what the pages called the siege. Water, offering, flashlights, my father's old hunting rifle, even though the pages said weapons were useless. The center room sat directly above the kitchen, equidistant from all exterior walls with no panes and only one door. The wireless set played 6 times that day, even though I'd moved it to the stone cellar and covered it with blankets. The tune seemed to come from the walls themselves, following me wherever I went. Each time, I had to abandon whatever I sat doing and find a different room. That evening, I laid out the dinner offering as usual, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. But I knew it wouldn't be taken. The entities were beyond that now, focused entirely on testing the house's defenses. The heavy knocks began at 8 p.m., 3 hours earlier than the first night. This time there were so many different patterns I couldn't count them all. Every possible entry point sat being tested simultaneously. Panes rattled in their window frames, hatches shook against their hinges, and something sat definitely trying to get into the stone cellar through the old coal chute. The wireless set played constantly now, switching between stations every few minutes. Country, classical, rock, talk shows, static, a chaotic mix that made it impossible to think clearly. I moved between rooms like a pinball, never able to stay anywhere for more than a few minutes. Around 2 a.m., something new happened. The heavy knocks fell quiet for about 30 seconds. Complete dead air except for the wireless set. Then it all began again, but now the rhythm sat different. All the entities were heavy knocks in unison, creating a single massive impact that shook the entire house. They were learning, adapting, working together in ways they hadn't before. I glanced at the calendar on the kitchen wall. Tomorrow night sat the full moon. I sat at my father's kitchen table with the yellowed note spread flat in front of me, reading it for what had to be the 20th time since finding it under the porch table. The paper felt in my bones brittle between my fingers, like it might crumble if I handled it wrong. But the ink, that sat the thing that kept throwing me. Fresh black ink and handwriting I'd seen on old family documents written by a man who'd been dead for over a century. The words hadn't changed since I'd first read them 3 days ago. But they still hit like a punch to the gut. 6 years of following those rules religiously, and they just fell quiet working, like a contract that had expired without warning. Late October night. That gave me exactly 2 months and 3 weeks. I'd been counting the days obsessively since finding the note like a prisoner marking time until execution. The thing sat still unplugged. I could see the cord from where I sat coiled on the floor next to the nightstand I dragged in here with me. But Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing began playing anyway. That same tiny sound from the old speakers. Soft at first, then louder. Much louder. The heavy knocks matched the beat perfectly. 3 knocks on the front door lined up with the trumpet section. The kitchen pane tapped along with the drums. The back door kept time with the bass line. It sat like the whole house had become some kind of instrument, and whatever sat out there sat playing it. I reached for the wireless set, thinking maybe I could turn it off or move it or something. But the moment my fingers touched the volume knob, the tune got louder. Way louder. Loud enough that I had to cover my ears. Loud enough that the sound seemed to come from inside my skull instead of the speakers. The heavy knocks got louder, too. Not just more frequent, actually louder. Like they were using hammers instead of knuckles. The whole house shook with each impact. Pictures rattled on the walls. The panes buzzed in their window frames. I pulled my hands away from the wireless set and the volume dropped back down, but it kept playing. The heavy knocks kept its perfect rhythm. They were working together, I realized. The entities outside and whatever sat making the wireless set play. They were coordinating this whole thing. This wasn't just testing anymore. This sat an attack. The song ended and immediately began over. Same tune, same beat, same perfect coordination with the heavy knocks. I counted 17 different entry points where they were hitting the house. Front door, back door, kitchen door, all the first floor panes, every upstairs pane, even what sounded like the stone cellar door I'd forgotten about. My heart hammered against my ribs. 6 years of following the rules, 6 years of clean dishes and respectful distance, and now they were trying to break down every barrier I had. The offerings hadn't worked. Staying inside hadn't worked. Even my father's rules weren't enough anymore. The wireless set cycled through the same song again and again. Each time the heavy knocks got more aggressive. I could hear wood creaking under the impacts. Something cracked upstairs. Maybe a pane frame, maybe worse. The stone cellar door rattled like someone sat throwing their whole body against it. I pulled the blankets around me and tried to think. My father had taught me 5 rules, but he'd never said what to do if they all failed at once. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe my father hadn't told him. Maybe this sat the thing they'd all been afraid would happen eventually. The tune sat so loud now I could feel it in my chest. The heavy knocks had become a constant thunder that made the whole house vibrate. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lantern on my folding table jumped with each impact. Then, just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of gray, everything fell quiet. The wireless set cut off mid-note. The heavy knocks ended so suddenly that the dead air felt in my bones like a physical thing pressing against my eardrums. I sat there in my father's chair, still gripping the armrests, listening to my own breathing and the sound of my pulse in my ears. I waited. The gray outside the front room doorway slowly brightened to pale yellow, then proper daylight. I waited until I could hear birds chirping and a truck rumbling past on the back road before I moved. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position all night. I squeezed past the oak dresser and walked through the house, checking each room. Everything glanced normal. No broken panes, no damaged hatches. Whatever they'd been doing, they hadn't actually broken anything inside. But when I stepped onto the front porch, my stomach dropped. The plate sat gone. For the first time in a week, they'd actually taken the offering. But the porch glanced like a construction crew had torn it apart and put it back together wrong. Half the boards were loose, nails sticking up at odd angles. Deep gouges ran across the wood grain. Not random scrapes, but deliberate carvings scored in patterns. I didn't recognize carvings maybe or some kind of writing. The porch railing had been twisted. The spindles bent into outlines that hurt to look at. The table where I'd been setting the dishes sat still there, but it had been moved about 3 feet to the left. The surface sat covered in more of those scored carvings, cut so deep they went almost halfway through the wood. I walked to where the plate had been, stepping carefully around the loose boards. That's when I made out it. A piece of paper tucked under the edge of the table, right where the plate would have sat. I picked it up with trembling hands. The paper sat old, yellowed at the edges, with that brittle feel of something that had been stored in and loft for decades, but the writing on it sat fresh, the ink still dark. The handwriting sat careful and precise with those old-fashioned flourishes people used to make when they wrote with fountain pens. I'd never seen it before, but somehow I knew exactly whose it sat. The same way you recognize a voice even when you haven't caught it in years. My great-great-grandfather's handwriting. The man who'd began all this, who'd made whatever deal had kept our family safe for 4 generations. The man who'd been dead for longer than I had been alive. The note sat short, just a few lines in that careful writing. Rowan Hale, if you're reading this, the 5 rules have failed and the arrangement is ending. There is a 6th rule I could not teach your father as it sat not yet time. When the moon wanes, you will find what you need in the root stone cellar behind the false wall. The choice will be yours alone. Remember, some bargains are meant to be temporary. Your great-great-grandfather. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling so badly the paper rustled. A 6th rule. Something hidden in the root stone cellar that my father had never mentioned, never even hinted at, and my great-great-grandfather had somehow known tonight would come, had somehow left me directions from beyond the grave. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped back toward the house. The scored carving seemed to watch me, and I had the unsettling feeling that whatever had made them sat still close by, waiting to see what I'd do next. The note crinkled in my pocket as I walked inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything sat about to change. I sat at my father's kitchen table with the yellowed note spread flat in front of me, reading it for what had to be the 20th time since finding it under the porch table. The paper felt in my bones brittle between my fingers, like it might crumble if I handled it wrong. But the ink, that sat the thing that kept throwing me. Fresh black ink and handwriting I'd seen on old family documents written by a man who'd been dead for over a century. The words hadn't changed since I'd first read them 3 days ago, but they still hit like a punch to the gut. 6 years of following those rules religiously and they just fell quiet, working like a contract that had expired without warning. I kept reading even though I could recite it from memory now. There is a 6th rule I could never teach your father. If the other 5 ever fail, you must leave this house permanently on the next late October night. The forces we've held at bay will eventually overwhelm any stationary defense. Abandoning the territory is the only way to reset the protection. Late October night. That gave me exactly 2 months and 3 weeks. I'd been counting the days obsessively since finding the note. Like a prisoner marking time until execution. The worst part sat the next paragraph, the one that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights. Understand this, Rowan Hale. We have never been stopping these forces permanently. We have only been buying time. Each generation has held them back long enough to pass the burden to the next. But some bargains are meant to be temporary. Buying time. That's all any of us had ever been doing. My father, grandfather, great-grandfather. All of them just holding the line until they could hand it off to the next poor bastard in the family tree. And now it sat ending with me. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket where I'd been carrying it like some kind of talisman. The kitchen felt in my bones different now, knowing I'd be leaving it forever. Everything glanced the same. My father's coffee mug still in the disher, his reading glasses on the windowsill. The calendar on the wall still turned to the month he'd died. But it all felt in my bones temporary now, like props in a play that sat about to close. The supernatural forces had kept up their nightly visit since that coordinated assault 3 nights ago, but something had changed. The heavy knocks still came, but it felt in my bones different. Less aggressive, more patient, like they knew something I sat just figuring out. Last night, there had been only 3 knocks at the front door, then nothing. The night before, just some soft tapping at the kitchen pane that lasted maybe 10 minutes. It sat like they were backing off, giving me space to process what sat coming. I walked through the house slowly, really looking at everything for maybe the first time since my father's funeral. The living room where I'd spent countless nights in his recliner, white-knuckling my way through supernatural sieges. The stairs I'd climbed as a kid, learning to step over the 3rd one that creaked. My father's bedroom, where that damn wireless set had played Glenn Miller with the cord unplugged. In my father's room, I began going through his things properly. Not the quick, grief-stricken sorting I'd done after the funeral, but a real search. If I sat leaving forever, I needed to understand what I sat walking away from. His dresser drawers held the usual stuff. Clothes, old watches, a few photos. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old towel, I found a leather ledger. I'd never seen before. The cover sat worn smooth from handling, and when I opened it, I recognized my father's careful handwriting. Rules and Observations, the first page read. For Rowan Hale, when he's ready. My hand shook as I turned the pages. My father had been keeping detailed records, dates, times, descriptions of supernatural activity, 6 years' worth of pages about the nightly offerings, the sounds, the patterns, things he'd never told me. October 15th, Rowan Hale's third week following the rules. The taking of offering happened at 11:47 p.m., 17 minutes later than usual. Possible adjustment period as the arrangement transfers to new generation. December 3rd. No activity for 2 nights following Rowan Hale's bout with flu. Entities seem to recognize when the rule keeper is incapacitated. Offering left pristine but not disturbed. March 22nd. Unusual scratching sounds at stone cellar door. Rowan Hale didn't hear them from upstairs. Note: stone cellar access may become relevant in future. Page after page of observations, patterns, theories. My father had been studying these things, trying to understand them better than just blindly following the rules. And at the very end, dated just 2 weeks before he died, sat an entry that made my blood run cold. The arrangement is showing strain. 17 consecutive nights of delayed offering, taking entities testing boundaries more frequently. Rowan Hale doesn't know yet, but I fear the rules may not hold much longer. If the worst happens, he'll need to find the 6th rule. Great-great-grandfather sat right to hide it from us. Some knowledge is too dangerous to carry unless absolutely necessary. He'd known. My father had known the rules were failing, and he'd died before he could tell me. I spent the rest of that day reading through every page, absorbing decades of family knowledge I'd never been given. By evening, I understood that what I'd thought sat a simple supernatural arrangement sat actually something much more complex, a carefully maintained balance that had been slowly shifting for generations. The next few weeks fell into a strange routine. The supernatural forces continued their nightly visits, but they felt in my bones more like check-ins than attacks. A few knocks here, some soft scratching there, the occasional sound of slow steps on the porch. They were still there, still watching, but the urgency sat gone. I used the time to gather everything I could. My father's ledger went into a box along with old family photos, documents, anything that told the story of what we'd been doing here. I found more journals in the loft, grandfather's pages, even some pages in great-grandfather's spidery handwriting. For generations of men documenting their battles with forces they didn't fully understand. The hardest part sat going through my father's personal things. His clothes, his books, the little everyday items that made up a life. I couldn't take much with me. The note had been clear about leaving permanently, and that suggested traveling light. But I packed a few photos, his favorite coffee mug, the watch grandfather had given him. By mid-November, the house felt in my bones like a museum of my family's history. Boxes stacked in the living room, labeled and organized, important documents in one pile, sentimental items in another, things to leave behind in a third. The supernatural forces seemed to approve of my preparations. The nightly disturbances became even more subdued, almost respectful. One night in late November, I sat sitting in my father's recliner when I caught something different. Not heavy knocks or scratching, but what sounded like voices, soft, indistinct, coming from somewhere outside. I crept to the front pane and peered through the curtains. The yard sat empty, but I could see outlines moving in the treein, dark outlines that seemed to shift and flow rather than walk. They were having some kind of gathering. And though I couldn't make out words, the tone sounded almost ceremonial, like they were preparing for something. Late October night arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the air itself feel sharp against my skin. I'd been awake since 4 in the dawn, not because I'd set an alarm, but because my body knew. After 2 months of preparation, this sat the day I'd leave the only home I'd ever known. The truck sat in the driveway, engine block heater plugged in since yesterday to make sure it'd start when the time came. I'd loaded most of my things over the past week, the essentials of 4 generations, condensed down to what could fit in the bed of a pickup truck. I stood at the kitchen pane with my last cup of coffee in this house, watching the sun struggle through the gray December sky. The note from my great-great-grandfather sat on the counter beside me. The paper worn soft from handling. I'd memorized every word by now, but I read it again anyway. When the moon wanes in the New Year's first hour, drive north on Kansas Highway K7 until you see the old grain elevator. Turn east at the crossroads and follow the gravel for 12 m. You'll know the place when you see it. A white farmhouse outside Atchison, Kansas with cobalt shutters, sitting empty, but waiting. The land there is clean. Start fresh, Rowan Hale. The bargain ends with your leaving. The directions were specific enough, but I'd never caught of any white farmhouse outside Atchison, Kansas with cobalt shutters in that area. Then again, my great-great-grandfather had been dead for over a century. A lot could change in that time. Or maybe something stayed exactly the same, waiting. I finished the coffee and set my father's mug in the sink for the last time. The house felt in my bones different today. Lighter somehow, like it sat already letting go. They knew I sat leaving. They were waiting. The last box sat on the kitchen table. Personal documents, birth certificates, the deed to the property, insurance papers. I decided to leave the deed behind. Whatever came next, this place wouldn't be mine anymore. The supernatural forces could have it back along with whatever they'd been waiting for all these generations. I carried the final box out to the truck, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The porch glanced strange without the nightly offering plate. I'd fell quiet leaving offerings 3 days ago, and nothing had complained. The scored carvings from that terrible night in October were still visible in the wood, though they'd faded some. Battle scars from a war that sat finally ending. The truck began on the second try. Diesel engine coughing to life in the cold. I let it warm up while I took one last walk through the house, checking that I hadn't forgotten anything important. The rooms glanced hollow with most of the furniture covered in sheets. I'd left the heavy pieces, my father's recliner, the kitchen table, the beds. Whoever came after me could decide what to do with them. In the living room, I fell quiet at the mantelpiece where 4 generations of family photos had sat. The window frames were packed away, but I could still see the faint outlines in the dust where they'd been. My father as a young man. Grandfather in his army uniform. My great-grandfather standing beside a horse I'd never seen. All of them had lived with the rules, followed the arrangement, bought time with their vigilance. But time had run out just like my great-great-grandfather had known it would. I locked the front door and walked to the truck without looking back. The engine had warmed up enough and the heater sat starting to blow actual heat instead of just cold air. I put the truck in reverse and backed down the driveway. Gravel crunching under the tires. That's when I made out them. Lights were moving in the fields around the property. Not flashlights or headlights, but something else entirely. Soft blue-white glows that drifted between the fence posts and through the bare corn stubble like oversized fireflies. There had to be dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spread out across the land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I fell quiet the truck at the end of the driveway and watched through the windshield. The lights moved with purpose, not random drifting. They were forming patterns, creating boundaries, marking territory. As I watched, more lights appeared at the tree-in, emerging from the Missouri River tree line, where I'd seen the dark outlines gathering in November. The supernatural forces were taking back their land. I could see outlines. I could see outlines moving between the lights now. Tall, flowing forms that seemed to bend and shift like smoke-given substance. They moved across the fields with an ancient confidence. No longer hiding or waiting, the arrangement sat over and they were reclaiming what had always been theirs. One of the lights drifted closer to the truck, hovering just beyond the fence line. For a moment, I thought I made out something almost human in its fever glow. A face maybe, or the suggestion of one. It pulsed once, twice, then moved away toward the house. Not threatening, just acknowledging a farewell perhaps or recognition that I sat keeping my part of the bargain. I put the truck in drive and pulled onto Kansas Highway K7, heading north like the note instructed. In the rear-view mirror, I watched the light spread across the entire property, growing brighter as I drove away. The farmhouse sat in the middle of it all, dark panes reflecting the supernatural fever glow. By dawn, I wondered if anyone would even remember there had been a house there at all. The road stretched ahead, empty and black under the star-filled sky. It sat just past 2 a.m. Year's first dawn, technically, though it felt in my bones more like an ending than a beginning. I'd driven these roads my whole life, but tonight they seemed different, like I sat seeing them for the first time. The old concrete grain elevator in Atchison appeared after 20 minutes of driving. Exactly where the note said it would be. I'd passed it countless times over the years, but I'd never really glanced at it. Now I could see it sat older than I'd thought. The concrete weathered and stained with faded letters spelling out something I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. I turned east at the crossroads, leaving the paved road for gravel. The truck's headlights cut through the night, illuminating fence posts and mailboxes. The occasional farmhouse set back from the road. Most were dark. People asleep getting ready for the new year ahead. Normal people with normal problems who'd never had to leave offering on their porches or count knocks in the night. The gravel road wound through rolling hills covered in cold rain, past abandoned barns and fields that stretched to the horizon. I counted the miles on the odometer. 5, 7, 10. At 11 miles, I began watching more carefully, looking for anything that matched the description in the note. At exactly 12 miles, I made out it. The white farmhouse outside Atchison, Kansas sat about a /4 mile off the road, connected by a long driveway that glanced recently plowed. Blue shutters flanked every pane, and a porch light glowed yellow against the cold rain. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight in the still air. Someone sat home, or at least someone had been recently. I turned into the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires as I approached the house. It sat smaller than the place I'd left behind, but it glanced solid, well-maintained. The kind of place where people lived normal lives, where the biggest worry might be whether the furnace would make it through another autumn. I parked near the front porch and sat in the truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The house sat dead still. No lights moving in the panes, no signs of the supernatural forces that had dominated my life for so long. Just a house sitting peacefully under the stars. A piece of paper sat tucked under the windshield wiper. I hadn't noticed it before, but it must have been placed there while I sat driving. I got out and retrieved it, recognizing the same handwriting as the note that had began this journey. The house is yours, Rowan Hale. The deed is in the kitchen drawer, along with keys and directions for the furnace. The land here has been waiting for someone who understands the old ways, but isn't bound by them. Rest now. The rules that governed your family for generations have served their purpose. You are free. I folded the note and put it in my pocket alongside the first one. 2 messages from a dead man guiding me from one life to another. I grabbed my overnight bag from the truck. The rest could wait until dawn and walked up the porch steps. The front door sat unlocked. Inside, the house sat warm and clean, furnished with simple but comfortable furniture. A fire burned low in the living room fireplace, and I could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen. Someone or something had laid out for my arrival. I found the deed in the kitchen drawer, just like the note promised. The property sat in my name, dated today, signed with my great-great-grandfather's familiar handwriting. Impossible. But then again, I'd fell quiet questioning impossible things months ago. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the pane at the dark fields beyond. No lights moved in the distance, no outlines gathered at the treein, just cold rain and starlight and the kind of dead still that came from being truly alone for the first time in my life. The family's long struggle with the supernatural forces had finally ended. The rules had done their job for generations, keeping the bargain intact, buying time until this moment when the arrangement could be concluded properly. My great-great-grandfather had known today would come, had planned for it, had made sure I'd have somewhere to go when the old ways were no longer enough. I sat free. The thought felt in my bones strange, almost foreign. No more nightly offerings, no more counting knocks, no more rules to follow. Just a normal life in a normal house where the biggest supernatural concern might be whether the coffee maker would work in the dawn. Outside, cold rain began to fall, soft flakes drifting past the kitchen pane. I finished my coffee and went to check the furnace, following the directions I'd found with the deed. Everything sat in working order, ready for whatever autumn might bring. I'd successfully escaped before the entities could break through the final defenses, but it didn't feel like an escape. It felt in my bones like completion. The end of a story that had been written long before I sat born played out exactly as it sat meant to be. Tomorrow, I'd unload the truck and start figuring out what came next. Tonight, I just sat by the fire and listened to the dead air, grateful for the first peaceful late October night I'd had in my entire life. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.